The silence of the house was the only thing Elara had truly owned for 5 years. It was a dense, physical presence, settling in the dust motes that danced in the slivers of morning light and clinging to the cold ashes in the hearth. It was the shape of the space on the bed beside her, the echo of a voice she could no longer recall without a pang of sharp, debilitating grief. Her husband, Elias, had been a man of quiet laughter, a sound the silence had long since consumed. Their other great silence had been the absence of a child's cry, a hope that had withered and died on the vine long before Elias himself had been taken by the fever. Now, her hands, chapped and strong, worked the unforgiving soil of a small garden plot. She planted seed she knew might not take, a ritual of hollow faith. The land around her small, isolated homestead was as barren and quiet as her womb, a constant, wind-scoured reminder of all that was gone, of all that would never be. She had learned to live with the silence, to wear it like a shroud, finding a grim sort of peace in its predictability. There were no surprises in a world pared down to sunrise, chores, and sunset. But today, the silence would be broken. She hitched the old mule to the wagon for the twice-yearly trip to the settlement, a journey she undertook with the stoicism of a pilgrim marching toward a necessary penance. The town was a place of noise, of staring eyes that saw her not as Elara, but as the widow, the barren woman from the dusty plains. In the center of the town square, a crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim necessity. An auction was underway. Not for cattle or land, but for people. Debtors, orphans, the dispossessed, souls sold to the highest bidder for a term of indenture. Elara stood at the edge of the crowd, intending only to pass, but the auctioneer's voice, sharp and cruel, snagged her. He shoved 3 young women onto the raised platform. They were sisters, it was plain in the way they huddled together, a small, terrified island in a sea of hungry eyes. The eldest, her chin held high in a fragile display of defiance, wrapped a protective arm around the other 2. "Now, this here is a special lot," the auctioneer sneered, a sour twist to his lips. "Lyra, Seren, and Anya. Good workers, I'm told." He paused for dramatic effect, letting his gaze sweep over the crowd. "But they come with a complication." He gestured dismissively at their gently rounded bellies, hidden beneath warm wool dresses. "All 3 are with child. A burden, some might say. 3 hands that'll soon be out of commission, and 3 more mouths to feed after that." A low murmur rippled through the onlookers. Men who had been sizing up the sisters' strength now scoffed and turned away. Women whispered behind their hands, a mix of pity and scorn. They were damaged goods, a poor investment. Silas Blackwood, the wealthiest landowner in the county, leaned against a post, a gold tooth glinting in his smug smile. He enjoyed the sport of degradation. He watched the sisters with the detached air of a man inspecting flawed livestock. He raised a finger, not in a real bid, but in a gesture of mockery. "I'll give you $1 for the lot." For the entertainment, the crowd chuckled. The sisters flinched as if struck. Humiliation washed over them, a visible tide of shame. The auctioneer, eager to please Blackwood, was about to bring the gavel down on the cruel joke when he saw it. A hand. A single, trembling hand raised from the back of the crowd. It was Elara. Her face was a pale, resolute mask, her eyes fixed on the 3 girls on the stage. She saw not a burden, but a trinity of life. She saw the ghost of a future she and Elias had prayed for until their knees were raw. The suffocating silence of her farm was a tomb, the potential cry of a single baby was a hymn of resurrection. In that moment, her hand did not feel like her own. It felt as if Elias were guiding it, pushing it up through the heavy shroud of her grief, into the cold, clear air. The auctioneer squinted, his rhythm broken. "A bid?" he asked, incredulous. Elara's voice was rusty from disuse, but it carried across the stunned silence. "I will take them." Silas Blackwood's amusement curdled into a dark glower. He pushed himself off the post, his substantial frame radiating menace as he moved toward Elara. He looked down at her, a predator assessing an insignificant stray that had wandered into his territory. "You know what you're buying, woman," he grunted, his voice a low growl of contempt. 3 broken mares. Useless for farm work. Elara met his gaze without flinching. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but 5 years of solitude had forged a different kind of strength in her. She had faced down the specters of loneliness and despair every single day. A mortal bully held less terror. "I know what I am doing," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. She turned back to the auctioneer, ignoring Blackwood's fuming presence. She pulled a small, worn leather pouch from her dress. Inside was the last of the money Elias had left her, coins she had hoarded for a final, desperate emergency. This, she knew, was it. She counted out the sum, more than the girls were worth by the town's cruel calculus, but a pittance for the salvation of 3 lives, and 3 more yet to come. The transaction was completed in a tense quiet. The sisters were prodded off the stage, their indenture papers thrust into Elara's hand. They looked at her with wide, terrified eyes, their expressions a painful mix of disbelief and dread. They had been spared public humiliation by Blackwood only to be claimed by a severe, silent woman who looked as harsh and unforgiving as the land she came from. The journey back to the farm was a long, rattling affair, shrouded in a heavy silence that was different from the one Elara knew. Hers was empty, this one was filled with unspoken fear. The sisters sat huddled in the back of the wagon, clutching their small bundles, their bodies swaying with the ruts in the road. Lyra, the eldest, watched Elara's rigid back with narrowed, suspicious eyes. Seren, the middle sister, wept without a sound, tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. Anya, the youngest, simply stared at the vast, empty horizon, her face a blank canvas of shock. Elara felt their terror like a physical weight. She offered no false reassurances, no hollow promises. Words were cheap. Instead, when the sun reached its brutal zenith, she stopped the mule, climbed into the back of the wagon, and uncorked her canteen. She passed it to Lyra first. Then she broke the loaf of bread she had bought and handed each of them a piece. It was a simple gesture, practical and direct. It was not comfort, but it was sustenance. It was a start. As dusk bled across the sky in bruised purples and oranges, they arrived. The homestead stood stark against the fading light, a lonely silhouette on a windswept plain. To Elara, it was home. To the sisters, it must have looked like the edge of the world, a final, desolate prison. The wind picked up, whispering through the dry grass, carrying a mournful tune that seemed to amplify the crushing isolation of the place. They stepped down from the wagon, their legs stiff, and stared at the dark, uninviting house that was now their fate. Elara led them inside, the scent of dust and disuse greeting them at the door. The interior was sparse, clean, but worn by time and sorrow. She lit a lantern, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to claw at the walls. Without a word, she led them past the main hearth and to the only bedroom. It was her room, the one she had shared with Elias. The quilt on the bed was faded, stitched by her own mother's hands. The air in the room was thick with memory. "This is yours," she said, her voice flat, betraying none of the sacrifice it cost her. She turned and left them, pulling a simple cot from a storage closet and placing it for herself near the cold fireplace. From the doorway, Lyra watched her, her expression unreadable. For the next few days, a fragile, unspoken truce settled over the house. Elara rose before the sun, her movements economical and precise. She stoked the fire, kneaded dough, and tended to the animals with a quiet competence that was both intimidating and strangely reassuring. She did not ask questions. She did not demand thanks. She simply worked, her actions weaving a thin thread of stability in the chaos of their upended lives. The sisters remained a unit, observing her from a distance. Lyra was the gatekeeper of their trust, her gaze sharp and questioning. She finally broke the silence on the third evening, as Elara was mending a tear in a worn blanket. "Why?" The word hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Elara did not look up from her needle. "Why did you buy us?" Lyra pressed, her voice trembling slightly. Elara pushed the needle through the cloth, pulled the thread taut. She paused, considering the 100 answers she could give, none of them easy, all of them true. The gaping void in her life, the ghost of her husband, the ache of her empty arms. But she chose the simplest. No one else would, she said. The answer was insufficient and yet, somehow, complete. It offered no sentimentality, only fact. Anya, the youngest and most hopeful, was the first to bridge the chasm. Drawn by the unfamiliar, comforting smell of baking bread, she drifted into the kitchen area, her hands clasped nervously. Ilara glanced at her, then pushed a small bowl of flour toward her. "Dust the board," she instructed gently. Anya hesitated for a second, then obeyed. As they worked side by side, a silent rhythm developed between them. A dusting of flour settled on Anya's nose, and for the first time in days, the shadow of a smile touched her lips. Ilara felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, like the first rays of sun after a long winter. Seren remained a ghost, wrapped in a blanket of fear, her nights filled with muffled sobs. Ilara did not intrude on her grief, but each morning, Seren would find a cup of warm chamomile tea left on the floor beside her pallet. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a gesture that said, "I see you." The turning point came on a cool, overcast afternoon. Ilara disappeared into the old barn, the one place she avoided because it was so full of Elias. After a long while, she emerged, dragging something heavy and draped in canvas. She brought it into the main room and pulled the covering away. It was a cradle. Beautifully carved from dark, rich wood, with smoothed, rounded edges. Elias had spent a winter making it, his patient hands shaping the wood while she imagined the child that would lie within it. It had stood empty in the barn for 7 years, a monument to their failed hope. She knelt and began to polish the wood with a soft cloth, her movement slow and reverent. The sisters watched, mesmerized. In the silent, tender act of restoring the cradle, they saw her story. They saw the barren garden, the empty space on the bed, the quiet desperation behind her stoic facade. Her pain was not their pain, but it rhymed. For the first time, they looked at her not as their owner or their savior, but as another woman who understood loss. The house was no longer just a shelter, it was becoming a sanctuary for their shared and separate sorrows. The fragile piece of their new life was a delicate thing, easily shattered. A week later, Lyra saw it first, a lone rider silhouetted against the morning sun on the eastern ridge. The figure was too far away to identify, but his purpose was clear. He was watching them. The rider was a harbinger, a dark omen that confirmed what Ilara already knew in her bones. Silas Blackwood was a man who did not tolerate defiance. He was a patient predator, and he considered the sisters his stolen property, a prize wrested from him by a woman he viewed as less than nothing. His pride had been wounded, and men like Blackwood treated wounded pride like a mortal injury, demanding a blood price. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath in the days that followed. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken tension and the promise of a coming storm. The clouds on the horizon gathered like a bruise, dark and ominous. Then, he came. Blackwood did not come alone. He rode at the head of 2 grim-faced men, their horses kicking up plumes of dust that seemed to choke the very air. They reined in before the small homestead, their presence an act of sheer intimidation. The sisters scrambled inside, their faces pale with terror, peering through the grimy window pane. Ilara stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She stood straight, her feet planted firmly on the wooden planks Elias had laid. The wind whipped strands of hair across her face, but she did not move. "Blackwood," she said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He smirked, a cruel, self-satisfied expression. "The quiet life treating you well, widow," he drawled, his eyes flicking past her to the house, where he knew the sisters were hiding. "I imagine the novelty of your purchase must be wearing thin. 3 pregnant girls can be quite a handful." He leaned against the porch rail, feigning a casual air. "I'm a reasonable man. I'll take them off your hands. Settle your debt. I'll even give you half of what you paid." A charitable offer, considering their condition. The threat was veiled, but clear. "Give them up, or I will take them." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. But her voice, when she spoke, was as steady and as hard as the stones in her garden. "They are not for sale." Blackwood's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of raw fury. "They are what I say they are," he snarled, his voice rising. And you are a lone woman on a worthless plot of land at the end of the world. Who is going to stop me?" He straightened up, gesturing to his men, who shifted in their saddles, their hands resting near the pistols at their hips. The air crackled. This was the moment. The breaking point. But Ilara was no longer the same woman who had raised a trembling hand at the auction. She had something to protect. She turned, her movements deliberate, and stepped back into the house for a single second. When she emerged, she was holding Elias's old hunting rifle. She didn't point it. She held it across her body, a solid, undeniable statement. The metal was cool and heavy in her hands. "You will leave my home," she said, her eyes locked on his. Just as Blackwood opened his mouth to laugh, to call her bluff, a second figure appeared in the doorway behind Ilara. It was Lyra, her face a mask of fierce resolve, her hands gripping a heavy iron poker from the hearth. Then Serin and Anya appeared behind her, armed with a cast-iron skillet and a sharpened wood axe. They were terrified, their bodies trembling, but they stood. A wall of defiance. A family. Blackwood stared, momentarily stunned by the sight. He was a bully who preyed on the weak and the isolated. He was not prepared for a fight against four women who had nothing left to lose. He spat on the ground, his face twisted in a mask of pure malice. "This isn't over, widow," he hissed. He swung himself back onto his horse, wheeled the animal around, and rode off, his men following close behind. As they disappeared over the ridge, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, and the low rumble of thunder finally broke across the plains. The storm that night was biblical. Rain lashed against the small house, and wind howled like a vengeful spirit, but inside, a different kind of atmosphere had taken hold. The terror had passed, leaving in its wake a steely, shared resolve. They had faced down the wolf at their door, and they had not broken. The fire in the hearth burned brighter than ever before, a defiant beacon against the raging darkness. They did not speak of what had happened, but the knowledge of it settled between them, a bond forged in the crucible of that confrontation. The rifle was cleaned and returned to its place above the mantel, no longer just a memory of Elias, but a symbol of their own strength. In the weeks that followed, the work on the farm took on a new urgency. They were no longer just surviving, they were fortifying their world. Together, they repaired the fence, cleared new ground for a larger garden, and hauled water until their muscles screamed. Lyra, her protective instincts now channeled into productive action, proved to be as strong and tireless as any man. Seren, having faced her deepest fear, began to emerge from her shell, her quiet presence becoming a source of steady calm. Anya's youthful optimism blossomed, her laughter a frequent sound that began to chase the last of the shadows from the corners of the house. The barren plot of land by the porch, Ilara's symbol of personal failure, was now a thriving patch of green. Under the sisters' care, shoots of corn, beans, and squash pushed through the soil, a testament to the life that was taking root in more ways than one. Ilara taught them what she knew of the land, and they, in turn, filled the silence with their presence, their hopes, their shared future. Then came the time of birth. Lyra was first, her labor as fierce and determined as her spirit. Ilara, whose hands had only ever known soil and dough and grief, now found herself a midwife. Using knowledge passed down from her grandmother, she guided Lyra through the pain, her voice calm and sure. As the first cry of a healthy baby boy echoed through the small house, it was as if the very walls sighed in relief. The silence was not just broken, it was vanquished. It was a sacred, revolutionary sound. 2 weeks later, Seren delivered a daughter, a quiet and watchful infant who seemed to possess her mother's gentle soul. And finally, Anya brought another boy into the world, his arrival a joyous, tearful affair. The single cradle Elias had built was now joined by 2 others, hastily but lovingly constructed from old crates. The house, once a tomb of quiet sorrow, was now overflowing with life. The air was filled with the scent of milk and clean linen and the constant, miraculous chorus of 3 infants. One evening, months later, Ilara sat in the rocking chair by the fire, holding Seren's sleeping daughter. The baby's tiny hand was curled around her finger. A profound, aching love filled Ilara's chest, a feeling so immense it almost hurt. It was the love she had buried with Elias, the love she thought had died with her hope for a child. But it had not died. It had only been waiting. Lyra sat across from her, mending a tiny shirt, while Anya hummed a soft lullaby to her son in his cradle. The scene was one of perfect, domestic peace, a peace that had been earned with courage and defiance. Ilara looked up, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the land was no longer barren. A full moon illuminated a landscape that was now patterned with thriving crops. In the far distance, on the familiar ridge, a lone rider was silhouetted against the sky. It could have been one of Blackwood's men. A year ago, the sight would have sent a jolt of pure terror through her. She would have reached for the rifle. But now, she simply watched, her heart steady. Lyra followed her gaze and came to stand beside her, her own baby asleep on her shoulder. They stood together, watching the distant figure. They were not afraid. The house behind them was a fortress, not of wood and stone, but of love and shared will. The world outside, with its Silas Blackwoods and its cruel auctions, was still there. The shadows would always gather at the edges of the light. But here, in this small, once empty homestead, for women and 3 children had built something the darkness could not touch. The hand Ilara had raised in the dust-choked town square had not simply bought 3 lives. It had planted a forest. It had built a future from the ashes of the past. It had created a family.